This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell's going on now?
What the hell is going on is we're talking about the corruption of climate science. And we've got a colleague from the American Enterprise Institute, Roger Pielke, who has a fantastic blog, and he's actually written an academic paper on this that shows that a lot of the baselines that we are being told about the worst case scenarios of the if we do nothing variety are antiquated based on the technology and data of 10 to 15 years ago and are not accurate, and they are affecting decisions that are being made by the Biden administration and by others that are leading us to possibly very bad and I would say catastrophic decisions when it comes to our economy and what we're doing in climate science. What do you think, Danny?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely fascinating to understand. And again, you and I are not deep in scientists and don't understand, all of the calculations that go into this. But what is absolutely striking to me is the politicization of science. This is fatal. And I don't mean that it's fatal because it's bad for politics or bad. It is fatal because people are no longer believing in scientists, right? Scientists have broken
or
their...
experts more broadly.
Yes, absolutely. They have broken their brand. Right?
Yes.
It is, and just as we blamed Tony Fauci for this during COVID, I think that the United Nations and the IPCC, their climate change forecasting, have done this on climate change. They have told people that things are going to happen that are not happening. It reminds me of this great exercise that I've talked about previously on this podcast that one of our colleagues used to do, which is to go back and look at the predictions for the future from the original Earth days in the early 70s. Every single one was completely wrong.
So you bring up Tony Fauci because we talk about this in our conversation. But what we did during the pandemic, and this is one of the reasons why the collapse in support of experts is, we put infectious disease experts in charge of the economy, right? And not only were they wrong about stuff like, oh my God, we have to close the schools. Oh, well, it turns out that kids were actually not susceptible to COVID, and we did more damage to them by closing the schools than we would have if we had left the schools open. But there were all these disastrous follow-on effects from the economic shutdowns and then the spending that went into it, which unleashed this inflation and which unleashed supply chain impacts, changed the way our economy functions to the point that nobody goes into the office anymore. And I mean, there's so many follow-on effects that were all driven by a call from the experts that said, this one problem is the most important problem and subsumes every other problem facing the country. And we need to put all of our resources at attacking this problem, and the follow-on effects and side effects be damned, right? I think that in many ways, the climate agenda is very similar to the COVID agenda. We've got a group of experts who have told us that we face an existential threat, which I don't think is correct. Climate change it's a problem. It's real. It's happening. I'll say this just for my bona fides, is that man-made climate change is real. It's happening, but it's not an existential threat. It's a problem that we can address. But they say we have to put everything at it. And so we're going to have everybody in electric cars by 2035, and we're going to ban fossil fuels by a certain point, and we're going to not just subsidize electric cars like we're doing with $7,500 subsidies for these cars, which if they were so great, you wouldn't have to subsidize them. But we're eventually going to tell people you can't drive gas-powered cars. And, oh, by the way, why don't we start researching into electric-powered tanks for the military? And and there's follow-on effects for national security. There's follow-on effects for the economy. There's follow-on effects for bringing people out of poverty in this country. There's follow-on effect for, Africa, which is the least developed continent in the world, who looks at us and the world is telling them, you can't use fossil fuels to develop. You have to because of the climate. And they're looking at us like, you use fossil fuels to develop, but we can't. So there's a whole, if you want to use the terms of the left, a racial justice inequity problem with all these follow-on effects. There's so many follow-on effects that this is the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Because a bunch of experts in the Kremlin decided we're going to have a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan for the economy. And no group of people, even in a democracy, can sit around a conference table in a nation's capital and figure out how to run an economy. The best way to run an economy is by millions of people making choices about their own lives. And these people are basically telling us, here's the car you can drive. Eventually, here's the stove you can use. And damn the economic consequences. And it's going to be disastrous. I mean, it's going to be a bigger disaster than anything that climate change will do. Am I wrong?
So I don't think you're wrong. I think that you are right. I think that it is correct for us to be concerned. I think that innovation is a wonderful thing. And insofar as we can fuel innovation by having serious, realistic conversations about climate change, that's great. I'm delighted to drive with lead free gas. I'm delighted when my hot water is heated up with solar power. I got to say, the one place, and we didn't talk to Roger about this, the one place where I'm not delighted is when I see windmills everywhere. That is garbage science, garbage technology, and isn't going to work as a solution. And it is devastatingly ugly and bad for the environment. I don't
And
get
we're
that.
spending billions and billions of dollars on it.
It's crap. I couldn't agree more. So this I want to explain to our listeners. We talk about this with Roger, but I think it's important to underscore this, and I want to kind of explain this in layman's terms before he really gets into the nitty-gritty of it. Part of the problem here is that the baseline scenario that we talk about, that the US government uses, that foreign governments use, that the United Nations use, and that everybody talks about, we don't identify it, right? We just kind of talk about it baseline. It has a name, and he talks about that, but it is actually not a baseline scenario. In fact, it is oh my God, the world is going to end, the sky is coming crashing down, Manhattan is going to be flooded, if only.
Can they flood Columbia University when they do it?
Oh my God, I'm so ready to get rid of both Los Angeles and Manhattan. But sorry, guys, if we
Both
have
just so you know, Danny and I just came back from an '80s festival in Pasadena and just spent a weekend in Los Angeles, as she calls it. And yeah, beautiful weather. Highways not so great.
see you guys. Yeah, exactly. By the way, these people are so concerned about climate. Get out of your damn car. Anyway, but I digress. But what is interesting about this absolute insane wacko scenario that has now been adopted by the mainstream as the baseline is that it wasn't a coincidence that it was adopted. This was paid for by two billionaires, Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, right? And they sat down more than 10 years ago, and the New York Times reported on this in 2012, sat down and picked the most radical scenario they could find to popularize in order to advance a more aggressive climate agenda. That is incredible. And everybody should understand that. When someone says to you, X is going to happen, the answer is A, X is not going to happen, and B, Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg paid for you to think that because they wanted you to think there was a crisis coming, even though there isn't.
But this is the original sin of the entire, climate religion, right? This is what, again, and
Bad science.
I'm not speaking for our
Bad
guest because
science is the
our guest
original
is
sin.
our guest is much more moderate in terms of his solutions and his views on this thing. But this is the original sin of the climate religion, which is they paid for a campaign to convince you that the world is coming to an end. And we have millions of children who are growing up thinking, I can't bring children into this world. I don't want to have children because the world is coming to the end and it's so terrible, when it's actually possibly the best time in human history to be alive. There's less disease, less poverty, more food, more availability of air conditioning, of heat, of temperature control, of wealth. There literally is never a better time in human history to be alive. I think our friends at the Brookings Institutions next door showed that in 2018, for the first time in 30,000 years since the dawn of agricultural civilization, more people are wealthy or middle class than poor or on the verge of poverty. That happened because of fossil fuel powered economic growth. And so we're actually in the best time in human history to be alive, and they want to convince us that the world is coming to an end. And if you convince people that the world is coming to an end, then they are going to throw everything at the kitchen sink at stopping the world from coming to an end. And that's going to do more damage to the world than the fake problem that they're trying to address. Tell me I'm wrong, Danny.
You're not wrong, but you are ranty. All right, we're going to actually bring in an expert who I hope our listeners will I hope our listeners will enjoy hearing from, because and what I really appreciate about Roger is that he's all about solutions and just
Unlike me.
right. Roger Pielke Jr. is a non-resident senior fellow at that excellent think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. He focuses on science and tech policy, the politicization of science, and energy and climate. He's also a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, a research associate of Risk Frontiers, in Sydney, Australia. Good God, he gets around. And an honorary professor of University College London. He's also a contributor and an editor of the Substack, The Honest Broker.
He's literally bringing wisdom to every continent.
Yeah, almost. We got to get him over to Africa.
Here's our interview. So, Roger, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Great to have you. So you've written a number of pieces, but one in particular that takes on this whole issue of corruption of climate science, that basically a lot of what we're being told about what's going to happen to the climate if we do nothing, and also the baselines of the climate science, that if it, the do nothing scenario, what would happen to the world and how much CO2 would be emitted and all the rest of it. A lot of this seems to be, I'll use the technical word, bunk. Can you walk us through your much more scientific analysis of that?
Yeah. So, when scientists make projections of the long-term future of the climate, obviously one of the most important factors that goes into those projections is how much fossil fuels we're going to burn in the future, because that leads to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, and it leads to a positive, what's called radiative forcing, which leads to a warming of the planet. So everything starts with the economy, what kind of energy sources we use, how we power them. And there's, I guess I call it the worst known secret in climate science. It's that the scenarios that underpin pretty much all of the projective studies that are out today are getting to be about 15 or 20 years old. And scenarios get out of date. We can't predict the future. If we could, we wouldn't need scenarios. But the real challenge is that even though most people in the climate community recognize that these scenarios are out of date, they persist. And so they're found, cited by the White House, cited in Congress. The Federal Reserve just last week issued a report citing these out of date scenarios. Science is self-correcting, but sometimes it takes a frustrating long time.
Can I ask, why has nobody updated them? Why is nobody? Is it because they're much more favorable to the the climate change argument, that they're there because they make it look worse than it's going to be?
Yeah, so a colleague of mine, Justin Ritchie, and I, we have a magnum opus 20,000 word paper where we talk about many of the factors that are underneath with this emergent phenomenon. It's certainly the case that some people really enjoy the most extreme scenarios, but I don't think that's the main reason why they stick around. Part of it is the way the climate science community operates. They put scenarios in place, put them up on a shelf, and then other researchers go take them off a shelf and use them in their research. And there hasn't been a tradition in climate science of rapidly updating their scenarios. One reason is that climate scientists want to do science. They're not, at least from the start, thinking about informing policy on an annual basis. Energy system modelers, like the Energy Information Agency, International Energy Agency, they update their scenarios every year because they're expected to be policy relevant. So there is a mismatch in the timescale of climate science and the needs of climate policy.
Roger, first of all, welcome. So glad you were able to join us. You are painting a very benign picture, and I think that there is a lot of goodwill in this community. Not the nuts, not for me, of course. Greta Thunberg is public enemy number one since draping herself in a keffiyeh outside the Eurovision contest and demonstrating against the Israeli singer. So I didn't think I could dislike her more. But it turns out this was a deeper well than I had understood. But there are people who are actually concerned about this and want to do good, and they're not there cooking the books. Others are, and this piece that you wrote in your Substack, The Honest Broker, is really interesting from April. I think for a lot of people, we're going to start using words that are confusing. And so what I would be grateful for is, as you explain what you wrote about at that time, you also explain the terminology, because what you talked about is what you've already alluded to with Mark is representation concentration pathway 8.5, RCP 8.5. Now, listeners, do not hang up right now. If they're going to talk about representation concentration pathways, we're not listening to it. Explain what that is and explain what's happened with it. And again, we're not much for conspiracy theories, but in fact, if you are, you're going to love this. Will you explain all of this?
Yeah. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, another acronym, IPCC. A lot of people have heard of that organization. Every 5, 6, 7 years, they collect all of the scenarios that the scientific community has produced. And it turns out it is thousands of scenarios because the future is a complicated place. You can't do systematic research on thousands of scenarios. So in 2005, the IPCC, an affiliated group with them, decided, all right, we're going to focus on 4 scenarios of the future. We're going to orient research around just these 4. That way, when research is done, we can compare this paper with that paper and so on. And what they did is they picked a very extreme scenario. That's the one that you mentioned, RCP 8.5. It suggests that we're going to burn up a lot of coal in the 21st century. In fact, all of it. And then they picked a very low scenario, which goes by RCP 2.6. That's more like the Paris Agreement. And then they picked 2 in the middle. It turns out, and this was a fateful mistake, when we know that it was a mistake today, the most extreme scenario, RCP 8.5, was labeled business as usual. This is where we're headed if we don't change course. And so it paints a picture of you could even say apocalyptic sort of future where temperatures rise, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius over today's values. And so that scenario has been built into the U.S. National Climate Assessment. It's been built into central bank stress testing. And the problem is we're not on that path.
How do you know we're not on that? How do we know? How does the average Joe know we're not on that path?
Well, we experts know because of a guy named Justin Ritchie, one of my colleagues, did the first most important work on this. But it assumes the sort of fanciful things that the average person can understand are not going to happen. So right now, around the world, there's something like 6,000 coal plants. This scenario assumes that we're going to build 30,000 more by 2100. That's not happening. India and China can go to town building coal plants. They're not going to build 30,000. This scenario was based on a theory from the 1990s about how energy systems develop and multiply, and that theory has proven to be wrong in this case. So it's pretty easy to show. I mean, just in the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years as I've been writing about this, I've seen the scientific community going from no, we're denying it. We're still on that business as usual path. To today, pretty much everybody accepts that no, that scenario is no longer plausible. So it's an interesting thing because the scientific community knows this, understands this, and has a general consensus about it, but it hasn't really snuck out of the scientific community into the more popular discourse or policy or the political world's starting to realize this. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the
And what's
next
the
few years.
conspiracy part?
Yeah, the conspiracy part is
Tom
that
Steyer and Mike Bloomberg.
Yeah, so a group of billionaires got together about a decade ago. They started a project called the Risky Business Project. And it was basically, it's very fashionable for billionaires to dabble in the climate space. But basically, what they did is they funded a bunch of research promoting and using RCP 8.5. And this was really what was brilliant about what they did. They didn't just produce a glossy report in a website and win the news cycle for a day or two. They funded researchers to go to scientific conferences and to publish their research in scientific journals. And that helped. It's not the cause of RCP 8.5, but it was a little bit like pouring gasoline on a fire. It really helped it, really eat all of climate science over the last decade.
So is RCP 8.5 like the script for Al Gore's movie? Is that like that? Is that what we're talking about here? Like, tidal waves taking over cities and, submerging coastal regions and all that stuff is is it based on that? And is that a scenario under which anyone might possibly be living in our lifetimes?
Yeah, I wouldn't even give an inconvenient truth that degree of credibility. That had sea level rising through, Manhattan, right before your eyes. That was a little bit more fanciful, and that was really when these RCPs were under development. So the answer, I guess, is no. It's not Al Gore's scenario, but it is an apocalypse scenario, and it does have, it has scientific uses, right? Because if you want to do climate modeling and you want to separate out, a forced signal of human impact from natural variability, then of course you want to use the most extreme scenario. That's useful for scientists. The problem is when you try to connect that science to policy making, planning, budgeting, the fact that it's implausible becomes really, really important.
Well, it becomes a tool for the climate change, extremists, because if they can paint a disastrous scenario, then one, it gives them fuel for their arguments, but two, it also makes what they're doing seem more effective, because if they even if they make a marginal change, then they could at least say that they're having an impact, right?
Well, it's interesting as the scientific community has become increasingly aware and has admitted that this scenario is implausible. One of the storylines that's promoted is, well, look, all of the climate policies we've put in place have gotten us off that path. We used to be on it, and now we're not, and that's just not true. But here's one puzzling thing, because if you actually tell people, yeah, we're on this very extreme path, then the costs of mitigation, the cost of energy policy changes are going to be so much more because you have to alter course in a much larger way than if we are on a more realistic lower path. So it has the advantages in political debate of saying, oh, look at this apocalyptic world, but it also disfavors policy. So it's a double-edged sword, I think, for activists.
So we had Bjorn Lomborg on the podcast a while back, and he pointed out that in October 2021, according to the UN Climate Panel, the cost of climate change by the end of the century, if we do nothing, so this is the baseline scenario, would be 2.6% of gross domestic product globally, right? By contrast, the costs of the extreme net zero climate policies would be 5.7 trillion a year, or 5.4% of global GDP over the next 3 decades, more than double the cost of doing nothing. Is that initial scenario that he cited, is that part of this inaccurate baseline? How do you see the cost benefit scenario of the accurate do nothing versus sort of the extreme climate policies?
Yeah. I know Bjorn. He's a good guy, but we disagree on this issue pretty fundamentally. Anyone who tells you they can predict anything to 2100, I got much less of the global economy or the costs of policy. We can't even predict who's going to win the next election. So the reality is, and this is an argument I've made for a long time, that successful climate policy is always going to be incremental, and it's going to be incremental when the actual benefits to the people who have to support it, so the publics around the world, are realized on political timescales. And in the United States, that's 2, 4, and 6 years. And we can set a direction of travel, but no one knows what the energy technologies of 2100 or 2050 or 2035 are going to be. And so it's a little bit like everything else we do in policy and politics in messy democracies is we take first steps and then we see where we're at. So I dismiss, cost-benefit arguments over the very long term, whether it's the social cost of carbon or Lomborg's arguments. There's a lot of good reasons for improving our energy policies. Some of them involve climate, but many of them result in accelerated decarbonization. So my view is, instead of focusing on 2100, let's focus on 2025 maybe.
I'm still focused on 2024, but that's my problem. So, I mean, I think a lot of what you're identifying and very genteelly disagreeing with is actually science as policy, right? Science that becomes those really annoying, and Mark knows how much I hate these signs on people's front lawns that signal how fucking virtuous they are and what shits the rest of us are because they believe the science and we don't, right? And this is the problem is the policy, as you rightly say. The scientists aren't, some are dishonest, but most are just scientists. It becomes the policy. I had not realized prior to doing the research for this, and I'm betting that a lot of our listeners don't know, that Joe Biden is planning on spending this $1.6 trillion, and yet, that was set aside for it, and yet has been incapable of spending almost any of it. But right now, what he's doing is, I guess, next week, so May 21st or so, is the moment when the deadline is for him to do new regulations that are not reviewable by Congress. So they are slamming through daily new regulations about energy, about oil and energy exploration, about natural gas exports. Help us understand a little bit, about what is going on policy-wise and why the public doesn't like some of it and whether it's going to work or not.
Yeah, so I did a piece, 2 weeks ago, looking at presidential administrations and emissions reductions under each president. And it's almost, since 2005, which is the baseline year the U.S. government uses for climate policy, it's been an almost linear decrease. The global financial crisis had a dip and then there was a rebound. The pandemic had a dip, there was a rebound. But the data suggests that presidents really don't matter for emissions reductions during their time in office. If you want to understand why U.S. emissions have gone down so much since 2005, you have to go back to the Ford presidency and look at energy policy put in place there that helped over 30, 40 years stimulate technologies of fracking. And really fracking in the 2000s, 2010s helped to displace coal. There were other policies put in place, but really energy policy making has impacts that are measured in decades after presidential libraries are built. And so the Biden administration has some kind of Teflon magic quality because under the Biden presidency, the U.S. has seen record oil and natural gas production. And at the same time, just recently he's talking about increasing tariffs on solar panels and electric vehicles by something like a factor of 4, which means it's going to be more expensive for people to take them up in the United States, slowing down decarbonization. And I have to think if we had a Republican president right now instead of a Democrat, then people would be howling about the oil production and the tariffs. The other fact is, under the Inflation Reduction Act, which we could call, a big part of it's a climate act, the Biden administration is not even going to come close to its desired emissions reduction targets. And again, this is something nobody talks about, but I would think that maybe in December it will be okay to talk about how far off the U.S. is from those 2030
Why are
targets.
why are we so far off from those targets? Is it that we're not doing the right thing, or that the targets are ridiculous?
So the president is really a taker of global economic activity, not a maker. And everyone wants to see more economic growth, less inflation, but altering I'll use a metaphor, the oil tanker that is the energy economy is not an easy thing to do. People like to drive, they like to fly, they like to power their homes, they want the lights to come on, and energy production is not as simple as unplugging the coal plant and plugging in the wind turbine. It takes a very long time to alter. I mean, it's good that the Biden administration has short-term targets. That's one thing climate policy hasn't had, really ever. And we can tell in 2024 whether the administration is on target to its 2030 target. And it's not. And the reason is that energy is not amenable to these short-term target setting. It's the sort of thing that if you want to set a target for 2050 or whatever, we have to start incrementally moving in that direction. It's a little bit like, think of it like advancing human lifespans. It's the sort of thing where we invest in public health measures, in medicines, and we see progress over many decades. But you can't say, all right, we want to set a target. Everyone's going to live 7 years longer by 2030. That's not how these dynamics of these complicated systems work.
One thing that the Biden administration, they're slowing it down now because they're worried about Michigan. They're not just worried about Arab American voters; they're worried about UAW workers in Michigan as well. They seem to be pulling back a lot of their EV regulations and or pushing them past the November election so they can make them once they're politically insulated. But there seems to be this push on the left in a very, very short time frame to ban gas powered cars and move us towards all EV fleet of cars, right? California is doing that. No gas powered cars can be sold in the state after 2035, which is, a decade from now. And they're trying to force this production. I have this feeling that this is a really, really bad idea. That one, there's going to be a rebellion. It's one thing now when you have to subsidize them and people buy them as like a second car and niche people can have them. It's entirely another thing politically when the government starts telling you you can't buy a gas powered car, you have to buy an EV. That's not going to be politically sustainable. And then all the problems with EV, from the rare earths to the fact that there are no electric earth movers to get the rare earths to, we don't have the electric grid to support it and all the rest of it. Am I off base here, or is this like push for put everybody in an electric vehicle within, a decade or more, a insane policy?
So, at the core of this, this dilemma, this dynamic you're talking about is a question about how does innovation happen in a complicated modern society, and there is a view out
Government
there
bureaucrats decide it, right?
Well, the government plays a big role for sure, but for some people, the idea is, well, if you take away something that people have, it will have to be filled with something better, and that's like proposing innovation on a schedule, on a calendar. I tell my kids, I was a small player in the great light bulb wars of 2011. And, we had a big political fight between the left and the right over incandescent light bulbs with their little squiggly little neon tubes versus, fluorescent light bulbs. That debate went away when LEDs advanced to the point where they were cheap enough that you can go down to Home Depot and get them, and they produce light that people seem to like, and they cost less. 2011 was probably premature to ban light bulbs that people wanted, and it was only a couple years after that issue went away. And so right now, consumers are showing a preference for plug-in hybrids over EVs, the full electric vehicles. Whether that continues or not, I don't know. But this is part of that incremental process that plug-in hybrids certainly can make a significant dent in gasoline use and emissions, even though they're not fully electric. And then along the way, I have a lot of faith in technological innovation. Batteries will get better, EVs will get better, and if they are a superior product, people will buy them. The Chinese BYO electric vehicles that President Biden is looking to put the tariffs on can be bought for something like $10,000 in China.
So, right, what you're talking about is eminently practical, right? So, weirdly enough, people don't want to turn off the power in their house and move back to candles, but if they can power their house more cheaply, they're probably game for it, right? If you live somewhere that rains all the time, you probably aren't thinking about solar panels. But if you're somewhere, in Florida, solar panels might be amazing. I would, we have friends who heat their pool with solar panels, and they save so much money. I would love to be able to do that, but I can't do that in, McLean, Virginia, because the weather sucks. but the problem is that this meetup with reality, if it were underpinned by rational conversation, would be great. Because it is a rational thing, and I think, all of us care about and love the planet and want to make it a better place and a sustainable place. The interesting thing to me, though, is that just as other people are kind of waking up to this craziness, right? So moving away from net zero in parts of Europe. The Germans are not just moving away from net zero, the Germans are actually building coal plants and then also burning, dirty coal, lignite, that we stopped burning ages ago. I don't think we need to go quite that retrograde. But Joe Biden still has not woken up and still won't abandon the same goals that the Europeans are now abandoning left, right, and center. Why?
So this is, I think, I mean, you think you put your finger on what I think is the big tragedy of climate policy. Climate policy is really about energy policy when we talk about mitigation, and energy policy has a lot of importance beyond climate. Energy costs, accessibility, affordability, U.S. security, geopolitics. At some point, both the left and the right decided that, hey, this climate issue really gets our base riled up. People on the far left and people on the far right. Everything for the climate or nothing for the climate. And the reality is that for the foreseeable future, any common sense practical energy policy, even if we're trying to dramatically reduce emissions, is going to be an all of the above policy. You know, one of the most shocking things about the Biden administration's recent energy policy decisions is the liquefied natural gas pause. That, you know, whether it actually becomes implemented or not after the election remains to be seen. But for me, the most shocking thing were the statements that came out of Japan and Europe that indicated that they hadn't been alerted or even discussed the LNG pause. And as Europe is shifting from Russian gas to other sources, and Japan is looking to close its coal plants and rely more on natural gas, it's more than a climate issue. It's more than an election issue. It's an issue of U.S. national security and the security of the U.S. allies. So I think there has been a level of unseriousness in the political world about climate change. And I don't mean unseriousness about the issue, but unseriousness about energy policy and thinking of it more as a sloganeering than policy, without realizing that, hey, these decisions we make about energy are profound and significant.
So here's a fundamental question. So accepting that human-caused climate change is real and it's happening, can we stop climate change and reduce the you can't reduce the temperature of the earth, but stop the growth of the temperature of the earth at acceptable economic cost?
Yeah. I hear you. So if you take a look at the emissions of carbon dioxide per unit of GDP, this is called the carbon intensity of our economy. That has actually been going down for as long as we can measure because we get more efficient in our economic activity, and we have a tradition, even without climate policy, of switching from dirtier to cleaner fuels. So if you move from coal to natural gas, for example, you cut out about half of the carbon. If you just take that linear trend that we have been on since at least the 1960s, and we keep that rate up, we're going to hit net zero at about 2080. So that might be
That's if we do nothing, right? No, I mean, if we keep doing what we're doing, right? If we don't do if we don't spend trillions of dollars on climate mitigation and all that, if we just keep going the way we're going, that's the real do nothing scenario, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, we already spend trillions of dollars on energy and energy investments, capital investments, and efficiency gains. It doesn't happen by magic. And so this is one of the things I try to impress upon people is that the so-called do nothing strategy is actually understanding how that innovation got us to where we are today and figuring out how to keep it going. And the energy economy, depending on how you measure it, is something like 10 to 15% of global GDP. It's enormous. It's incredible, and it gets us in the energy rich world. It gets us all the bountiful things that we enjoy. There are going to be people who want that everywhere in the world, and there's 3, 4, 5 billion people who don't have that. So the do nothing strategy is actually do an awful lot strategy. And my argument is it's going to cost a lot to keep energy progress going. So we should be smart about it. And it's too important to be reduced to the politics of today or tomorrow. Of course energy has a lot of politics, but it can't only be politics.
I guess the follow-up question really is, there's two approaches to climate if you accept that climate change is real, which is one is mitigation and the other is adaptation, right? And adaptation is a lot less expensive than mitigation. Adaptation is, there's hundreds of millions of people who live below sea level. You can build a dike. It's not hard. It's not expensive. But trying to stop the climate from warming is incredibly expensive. And there are huge opportunity costs. I mean, if Biden is spending $1.6 trillion on climate, I can think of ways to spend $1.6 trillion that might have a bigger impact on on poverty, to pick the subject. I mean, if you want to talk about existential threats, the threat from China, I think the Defense Department could use $1.6 trillion to, improve our ability to deter China and prevent World War III. There's lots of opportunity costs from this spending. Is this a good investment of our money?
So I think we have to get much more granular than adaptation versus mitigation, and should we mitigate? How we mitigate matters, and I'll give you two kind of parallel examples, and one is agriculture, and the other is health. The world has made tremendous progress on agricultural productivity, over the last almost a century, since the Green Revolution. And public health, I just read that people who had infected teeth before penicillin, 10 to 40% died from that. And so the progress we've made on those have cost a lot of money. But at the same time, there's sustained public support for investments in agricultural improvements and health improvements because they see the benefits in the short term. Energy is very similar. We're going to have to spend a lot of money on energy going forward, and that spending will only be sustainable if the public sees that they're getting real benefits from that. So that might be cheaper energy sources, less pollution, more security. In places outside the U.S., it might be access, just simple access to electricity. So I don't think the idea mitigation costs a lot is quite right, because the only way mitigation works in a democracy is if it doesn't cost a lot. And the question is, can we implement policies that don't cost a lot and at the same time improve all of the dimensions of energy that we care about, including emissions? And history says the answer to that is yes. So I don't reduce it to, I guess, mitigation costs a lot, adaptation is easy. Both are going to cost a lot and only work if people get benefits.
Right. They only work if they work. And I think part of the problem is people see an enormous amount of money being spent by a nanny state telling them to do things. But I want to come back to this perversion of science problem. Not because I want to suggest that climate change isn't real. You're not allowed to doubt, obviously. We know this has become like the Inquisition, right? You can't have this kind of a conversation in which there are three people who recognize that anthropogenic warming is real, but have different ideas about how to move forward. That is unacceptable, sacrilege, and we would be burned at the stake if it were another era. And potentially we could be. God knows what will happen next year. But what interests me a lot is the public dislike of this. So on the one side, you have these, fanatic Torquemada of the climate revolution. And on the other side, you have these angry, I'm going to drive my 1968 Dodge Charger with leaded gas and fuck you, everybody. Because I don't believe those stupid experts. Look what they made me do. They gave RFK a brainworm. I had to work that in somewhere. And what was interesting to me about this is there was an article today in Nature magazine that the Wall Street Journal wrote about. Did you see this? From this guy Ulf Bündgen. I can't believe being named Ulf Bündgen. He is actually saying that
Or that you can pronounce it.
Well, that I can do pretty well. But he writes, I'm foremost concerned by an increasing number of climate scientists becoming climate activists, because scholars should not have a priori interests in the outcome of their studies. Now, there are lots of people like that. It's the fact that Nature published this that was interesting to me. Do you think that we're on a track to become less crazy and more practical? Or is that just like a straw in the wind that isn't leading anywhere?
I mean, that's a good description of the current struggle across a lot of areas of science right now. And I have a lot of friends and colleagues that are in the climate space, and they're wonderful people. But the fact of the matter is, the climate space is not particularly representative of anything other than rich Western male academics who lean very far to the left. I wrote recently about a study that explored views of degrowth among climate researchers who published in the IPCC, and a shocking number, like I don't remember, like 30 to 40% were advocates of degrowth, which is
Wait, what's
not like.
degrowth? Tell everybody what degrowth is. It sounds like Soylent Green.
Yeah, well, not far. Degrowth is the theory that in order to deal with climate change, governments need to limit or reduce the size of economies so people become poorer, and mainly in the rich world. So no flying on airplanes and no ice cubes, to quote one IPCC leader. It's a problem because a lot of the work the IPCC does is it's science, it's impacts, it's economics, but it's not politics and it's not policy. There's no politician that I'm aware of on planet Earth who has ever won election on a platform of degrowth. We're going to make everybody poorer. That doesn't go over well. So there is this challenge of how do we get good science that is socially robust when the members of the scientific community producing that science have a narrow slice of political views that are at odds with most people in the countries they live or around the world. That is a challenge.
So, I mean, exactly, right? You can't have a normal productive conversation if the people involved don't have normal productive views. And that's exactly right. Or if they don't have appropriate scenarios. But what has been super interesting to me is, as somebody who's a complete outsider, I'm a foreign policy person. But what I see is that this shoddy science, where it is shoddy, has now been injected into everything. So if you look across the board, not just at foreign assistance to Africa, which, my God, really? You guys have gone from, extreme poverty and now we want you to engage in degrowth in order to pay for our growth? This is gross. The Department of Defense spends tens of billions of dollars on this crap. Electric tanks being the least of it, right? Well, but I mean, oh wait, sorry, Putin, wait one sec. I've just got to go plug in. But I'm coming back for you. Just wait an hour if it's a fast charger. No, but I mean, I'm making fun, but it's in every single bill. It doesn't matter whether it's women, related to women, or health, or education. Everything now has an increasing chunk of cash that is spent on this indoctrination, not mitigation. Are we ever going to be able to turn this back, or is reality just no longer a factor?
Well, I like to I say this a lot, and I believe it most days, but not every day. Science is self-correcting. It just takes a little while. But in theory, democracies are self-correcting also. And the question is how much frustration, how much pain, how much mistake do we have to make before that self-correction process works? In theory, we use experts in democracies to help make that feedback self-correction process work a little bit better. And one of the things that I've written a lot about and worked a lot on is expert advisory mechanisms. And there has been a weakening of expert advisory mechanisms in many important areas. COVID's one of them. Climate is another. I mean, take the U.S. National Climate Assessment. That was established in a 1990 bill that created the Climate Research Program for the U.S. government. The design flaw was they located it in the White House, in the Executive Office of the President. And it is just too tempting, and this happens under Republicans and Democrats, for the administration to put their thumb on the scale, to use an assessment to advance their administration's policy goals. And so we don't get a straight scoop on climate, and we don't get recommendations for the sorts of policies that might have a broader appeal than, say, the IRA, which passed with only Democrats voting for it. That's a design flaw. It's quite possible to create a climate assessment that's not in the White House, that as part of its impanelment process includes people from Texas and Nebraska and Montana, as well as people from California and New York and Vermont. And so until we seek expert advice that helps us to design policies that are practical, common sense, sustainable, and of broad appeal, we're going to have this kind of whiplash effect. And like you say, it leads to some kind of perverse outcomes in some cases, which is just bad policy.
So, I mean, Danny raised the national security example of, let's have electric tanks. And it makes me feel that like putting climate experts in charge of national security is kind of like putting infectious disease experts in charge of the economy. The results are absolutely disastrous. We saw that during the pandemic, because there's all sorts of side effects that have nothing to do with infectious disease, but like all of a sudden there's learning loss in schools, and we our economy can't recover, and you create all sorts of inalterable changes that you can't go back and fix later on. And I think, it's the same to some extent with climate. When the experts tell us that this one overarching goal is more important than anything else, then they push it through with government policies, then there's all sorts of side effects to the economy, to people's lives that are unanticipatable, because that's the way the world works. As conservatives, we believe that government shouldn't pick winners and losers. But yet, the government has decided EVs are the future. And the government has decided that, apparently the Wall Street Journal reported by 2032, there's going to be a rule that you have to use carbon capture technology in all, coal and natural gas plants. If you want to build one, that uses like 20 to 25% of the electricity. So we could actually have a net reduction in electricity production out of this. Should we be making all these decisions through the prism of climate, or should it be one consideration among many in our decision making on things that are going to affect our national security, our way of life, the ability to pull people out of poverty, to create, a thriving free society?
I mean, this is something that my colleague Mike Hume at Cambridge in the UK has written a lot about, how climate has grown as an issue so that it, in some instances, subsumes everything else. And in many issues, climate is not a particularly significant factor. And I think, national security is one of those. I find it hard to believe that people in the Biden administration today don't fully understand that it's better for U.S. interests if the U.S. is the world's largest supplier of liquefied natural gas. Because if the U.S. doesn't supply it, it's going to come from Qatar, or it'll come from Russia. It'll come from somewhere else. And we've learned, over the last almost a century, what happens when the U.S. becomes reliant on energy supplies outside the U.S. borders. So there are issues for which, and let me say, expanding the use of natural gas globally, to the extent it can be used to reduce coal, also reduces emissions. It's not solving the whole issue, but it does move us in the right direction. Another one, nuclear power. The U.S. would be well served to be the source of nuclear energy for the 21st century, because Southeast Asia, the continent of Africa, are all going to be expanding electricity consumption going forward, and that's going to come from somewhere. And so, it's one of those things that, I have a PhD in political science, but I'm still baffled. How governments, not just the U.S., but Germany, Japan for a period, though they're coming to their senses, decided to abandon the expansion and improvement of nuclear energy. I mean, that's a no-brainer if there ever was one. So
and also banned uranium mining.
Yeah.
They're actually going to make us more dependent on Russian uranium.
Right. So there are these issues where I do think we get mixed up as to priorities, and that's normal in democracies. They're not perfectly efficient, but I think we experts, whether it's foreign policy or climate, have kind of made things worse by ourselves becoming overly politicized on these issues.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I was thinking as you were talking about nuclear, and Mark and I have talked a lot about this, and we're going to let you go. I'm not even going to ask a question. But I was thinking about the fact that when you were talking about this, remember when we had that huge mania over the important invention of cold fusion, right? Somebody's going to do it, and then it's going to be magic. But of course, if we didn't have nuclear power and somebody invented it now, everybody would be like, this is the solution. Oh my God, brilliant. The world is saved. And yet, because it is an older and maybe in some ways less understood technology, and because it obviously has dual applications, people are like, ooh, never. It's absolute crank stuff. We should be switching to nuclear everywhere. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Roger. We took, of course, way more of your time, as we always do, but we're super grateful. And Mark from the back of his car is really grateful as well.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. So, Mark, what'd you think?
So, first of all, he's brilliant, very measured, very reasonable, and he's been labeled a climate denier by a left-wing member of Congress who wants to be a senator from Arizona. So there you have it. There you've heard what the left considers a climate denier. But I want to talk about this national security issue that you raised, because I think it's something that is overlooked in sort of the side effects that I was talking about. You know, if you go back to the history of the Cold War, the U.S., we had the Manhattan Project, right? And we built a nuclear weapon. And as soon as we achieved nuclear superiority, the left decided that its cause would be nuclear disarmament, right? So here we are, you know, more than half a century later, and the United States, thanks to the fracking revolution, has achieved energy superiority. We are a fossil fuel superpower. And what does the left want to do? They want to disarm. Right? They want energy disarmament. They want us to get rid of fossil fuels and push for these push the whole economy and the entire world into these unknown technologies. This has all sorts of side effects. For example, China right now, we're trying to get them to meet climate goals and to transition to away from fossil fuels. Right now, they're the largest importer of fossil fuels in the world. And where did those fossil fuels go? They come across the Strait of Malacca. And the Chinese were to attack Taiwan, one of the ways that we would respond would be to cut off their oil shipments across the Strait of Malacca. It's a great small niche national security advantage that we have. The Chinese are dependent on oil, and we can strangle their oil supplies and get them to help deter them. But not if they become independent of fossil fuels. Right? If we start pushing, so we're literally pushing them to do something that it does not advance our national security interests. And this is just one small example, but there's so many follow-on side effects of these climate policies that nobody has thought through, because nobody can think it through, because you can't sit in a conference room in Washington and think through all the possibilities. War games never turn out the way the actual war does, because you can't do it. What's the famous phrase that every war plan, as soon as it meets first contact with the enemy, has to be changed? Well, it's the same thing with the economy, and it's the same thing with other things. So I think we're just doing so much damage to ourselves in national security and in the economy and all the rest of it and no one seems to care about the follow-on effects of all this.
Look, we don't. We're not good at that. We are not interested in talking about the implications of this. And you alluded to that when we were speaking earlier about what we did during COVID. You know, when you pour trillions of dollars into an economy, weirdly, it causes inflation. When you continue spending as if money is free and grows on trees, then you are going to again cause inflation, and we are still paying the price. And one of the reasons, if Joe Biden loses this election, one of the reasons why he is going to lose it is because of that. You would think that at a certain moment there would be an adult in Washington D.C. who would turn around and say, hey, maybe this has some consequences we're not thinking about. Because Mark, it's not just about oil and gas. It's about allowing the Chinese to dominate our solar panel industry. It's about rare earths. It's about, as you say, uranium mining. It's about the consequences of this. And if climate people were not involved in a religion that is more crazy than Scientology, right? If they were not involved in this and their belief in it was not much stronger than many Christians and Jews' belief in their own religion, then we could talk about something like the fact that Germany decided in one fell swoop to get rid of its nuclear energy plants, its nuclear plants, shut them all down, mothballed them completely, and is now burning more coal and more dirty coal than anyone in the United States because they did
The
that.
same geniuses who thought that it would be really smart to make their entire economy dependent on Russian natural gas through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline are now getting rid of nuclear power. Good for them. This is what I mean. This is why
Yes,
you
it
can't
is.
trust politicians and experts teaming up to tell us how to run things is a recipe for disaster on almost any topic, whether it's pandemics or climate.
Look, I work at a think tank, and so do you. I'm a big believer in experts. I'm also a big believer in debate, but I'm also a big believer in rational thinking and in believing my eyes when I see the Germans burning this, believing my eyes when I see that the Pentagon is wasting billions of dollars on this climate bullshit. Again, it's like so many things. We have terrible leadership, and there are no adults running anything. It's just a race between nuts as to who can get closer to the bottom.
Yeah, I'm a believer in experts tempered by the common wisdom of the American people through the democratic process. I believe in the 5,000 people in the Boston telephone directory have more wisdom than the faculty of Harvard College. The faculty of Harvard College have something to say, but the people in the telephone directory get the final say, and we get into disaster when the faculty of Harvard starts telling us, you will listen to us and do it our way, or you will face the consequences, which is what seems to be going on with climate and many other things.
Yep, there you go. And that
All
is
right.
excellent final word. Folks, thanks for being with us. Let us know what you think.
All right. Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.